They didn't burn books out of fear of paper. They burned them because certain words, when read with awakened eyes, ignite something that can no longer be extinguished. I know this because I've spent years following traces that history tried to erase, comparing codices that don't appear in courses, cross-referencing translations that no one cites, reading what remained in the margins, between the lines, in the silences. And that's why today I speak to you from a different place, not as someone who repeats the canon, but as someone who walks in forbidden territory, the one where truth doesn't offer itself, it reveals itself. The Gospel of Philip, buried in the Egyptian desert and rediscovered only in 1945, is treated as an academic curiosity. But I say it is a living artifact. There is a passage there that almost all scholars rush past, as if the text burned their eyes. In it, Jesus withdraws with 3 disciples and speaks of the Father by name. Not titles, not metaphors, not doctrines, but specific names, sounds that the manuscript describes as openings. Have you ever wondered why the 4th century church went to the trouble of hunting down entire communities because of words? Why they decreed death to anyone who dared to pronounce them? I have asked myself this question hundreds of times, and the more manuscripts I cross-referenced, the clearer it became it wasn't heresy, it was efficiency. It worked. It gave people direct access to the source, without an altar, without a priest, without an empire. I speak to you now as someone who has seen too much to continue pretending that all of this is symbolic. It is not. If you are reading these lines, it was not by chance that you were brought here. The algorithm does not suggest what does not resonate. Something within you recognized it even before understanding. 3 names. A monad. A gate that does not open outwards, but inwards. What you feel now, this restlessness that is neither fear nor curiosity, is memory. Your mind has been trained to forget, but the soul does not learn to lie. Place your hand on your chest for a moment and simply notice the rhythm of your heart. Don't analyze it. Feel it. This pulse isn't just biology, it's language. It's the source breathing through you. You've never been separate, you've only been convinced of it. And I know how much this statement contradicts everything you've heard your whole life, but the role of those who reveal mysteries isn't to comfort, it's to destabilize. Gnostic texts always spoke of 3 types of humanity, but the canon erased this as if it were an offense against equality. It wasn't. It was a diagnosis. There were the hylics, attached to the visible. The psychics, who sense that something is wrong, but don't know what. And the pneumatics, those whose spark never goes out, the strangers since childhood, those who never fit into the social theater. If these words are not just passing through your head, but echoing in your chest, you know which group you belong to. And I don't say this to inflate your ego, but to explain loneliness. You have always felt displaced because this world was not designed for you. There is a parasitic intelligence that the ancients called archons. They are not horned demons, but implanted patterns, systems, and ideas that whisper inside you that all of this is fantasy, that you should get out of here, that none of this is real. That voice that tries to pull you out now is not yours. It was installed. And the first step to awakening is to perceive this without fighting it, simply by acknowledging it. Breathe slowly as you read, not as an exercise, but as a signal to your body that something different is happening. I learned, reading forgotten translations, that the 3 names of the monad are not random. Each corresponds to a type of opening, a type of reconnection. The first name doesn't give you power, it restores your identity. It's the gateway to recognition, the moment when the spark remembers where it came from. In the middle of this text, I want you to do something simple, but not trivial. If what you are reading makes sense beyond logic, write the phrase "I am ready now" in the comments. It's not for me, it's not for the system. It's for you. It's a gesture of alignment. Others who also carry this spark will see and understand that they are not alone. You can't imagine how much this kind of silent recognition changes the field. For centuries, everything was done to make you believe that you depend on mediation, that you need to ask, beg, wait for authorization. But the buried manuscripts tell a different story. They speak of direct, intimate access, dangerous to any structure that relies on control. And that is why libraries were burned, professors executed, texts buried in clay jars in the desert, like seeds waiting for the right season. I'm not here to give you ready-made answers. I'm here to point out cracks in the structure you've always taken for granted. Question the obvious. Be wary of what seems too simple. Compare versions. Read what was left out. It is in this process that the monad begins to become more than just a word. What I haven't told you yet, and won't fully reveal now, is that there's a specific sound, painstakingly preserved, that initiates this process of recognition. A name not pronounced out of curiosity, but out of remembrance. And that's exactly where I'll stop for today, because true teaching is never delivered all at once. It insinuates itself, provokes thirst, creates space. If something inside you started stirring while you were reading, don't ignore it. This isn't a passing emotion, it's preparation. In the next part, I'll guide you to the origin of this sound that almost disappeared from history, and you'll understand why it was considered too dangerous to remain on the altars. I need to pause before continuing, because the story we're telling can be read in two ways. One as a metaphor, the other as an inner experience. I'll follow the symbolic path, like someone describing an ancient map, and it's up to you to decide if it speaks only of the mind or of something deeper. Nothing I say replaces your autonomy nor creates any obligation. My role here is to provoke reflection, not to guide belief. When I started studying the Nag Hammadi texts, it wasn't out of faith, it was out of exhaustion. Exhaustion from ready-made answers, from explanations that didn't fit real life. I worked, paid bills, tried to be functional, but I felt a constant noise, as if I were always late for an appointment I couldn't remember. One day, reading an obscure passage from the Gospel of Philip, I had the strange feeling that the text wasn't informing me, but observing me. It's difficult to explain this without sounding too mystical, but it was as if someone had written those lines knowing that, centuries later, an ordinary person, sitting in a messy kitchen with unwashed dishes, would feel exactly that tightness in their chest. Perhaps you recognize this scenario. The house too quiet at night, the cell phone glowing in the dark, the feeling that, even surrounded by people during the day, there is something within you that remains untouched. Gnostic texts describe this as the sign of a dormant spark, but you don't need to accept this language to understand the experience. Everyone has felt this disconnect, as if life itself were a garment a size too small. I began collecting accounts from people who had never heard of Gnosis, but described similar things. A teacher wrote to me saying that, at 40, she realized she was repeating automatic phrases to her students, as if she weren't really there. An Uber driver said that sometimes he parks his car and watches the traffic go by, feeling that it's not exactly wrong, but it's not whole either. They are banal scenes, almost invisible, and yet laden with a kind of melancholy that doesn't fit into common explanations. The manuscripts speak of 3 human categories, but I prefer to translate that into something more everyday. There are people who live fully immersed in what they do, others who perceive cracks in the scenery, and others who can no longer pretend that the stage is reality. It's not superiority, it's discomfort. It's that unease that accompanies you even in the supermarket, when you look at the crowded shelves and wonder, for a few seconds, what you're really looking for. What's most disturbing is that the more you try to ignore this feeling, the more it seeps into the details. In the silence after turning off a series, in the echo of an empty conversation, in the tiredness that doesn't go away even after sleeping. The ancients called this the action of the archons, but you can think of it simply as social conditioning, patterns repeated until they seem natural. Suddenly, a doubt arises in your head, and you dismiss it as nonsense before even listening to it. That's how the noise persists. I myself have closed books mid-reading because a part of me told me it wasn't useful, that I should focus on something more practical. But I always went back, as if I were leaving something unfinished. One day, reading a passage about names that open, I instinctively closed my eyes and felt a strange warmth in my hands. Nothing spectacular, no flash, just a mild discomfort, like when you realize you've forgotten something important at home and don't know what it is. This kind of experience doesn't make headlines, but it leaves a mark. Perhaps you are reading this now during your work break, on the bus, or before bed. The setting doesn't matter. What matters is the question that begins to form behind the reading: what if the story you've learned about yourself is incomplete? Not wrong, but incomplete, like a book with pages torn out. This question doesn't demand an immediate answer, it simply creates space. The texts buried in the desert didn't survive by chance. They were hidden by people who knew they might never see the result of their actions. They simply trusted that someone, at another time, would feel the same unease. I imagine these scenes as something very simple: hands dirty with earth, clay jars, the fear of being seen. Nothing grand, just the silent persistence of those who don't want it all to end there. If you feel this reading is stirring something deep within you, it's not because I'm saying something extraordinary, but because I'm pointing to common experiences that are almost never named. The mystery isn't outside, it hides in everyday life, in the moments when you stop scrolling and remain silent for a few seconds, without knowing why. And this is where the narrative takes a slight turn. Because I could continue describing sensations and old texts, but that wouldn't explain why some people, upon encountering this type of material, report real changes in how they perceive decisions, fears, and even old memories. Not as a miracle, but as a reorganization, as if something were aligning internally. I haven't mentioned any names or sounds yet, and yet perhaps you are already different from when you started reading. Keep this in mind. Observe yourself in the coming hours, in small gestures, in the pauses between tasks. See if a silent curiosity arises, a desire to better understand what has been implied. It is this disposition that the texts describe as the beginning of openness, not a mystical event, but an almost imperceptible shift. In the next part, I'll tell you how some of these manuscripts describe the first stage of this process, not as a ritual, but as internal recognition, something that can happen while you're washing dishes, driving in traffic, or staring at the ceiling before bed. That's when the story begins to move beyond being merely ancient and starts to directly affect your own routine. When I returned to the manuscripts after years, I noticed something that had escaped me in my first readings. It wasn't the literal content that eluded me, but the tone. The authors weren't writing as if transmitting doctrine, they were writing as if trying to remind someone of something that has already been forgotten. There is no voice of a distant master, but rather that of an accomplice, someone who whispers you've been here before, you just don't remember. This detail changes everything, because it transforms the text into a mirror, not a manual. I began reading these fragments as one observes one's own routine with different eyes. I noticed that most of my day happens on autopilot, and that the few times something truly touches me are those where logic fails, when an old song moves me for no reason, or when a memory appears out of nowhere and changes my mood for hours. Gnostics would call this signs of the spark, but you can think of them simply as gaps, small glitches in the programming. It was then that I began to suspect an unsettling hypothesis: what if awakening isn't a grand event, but a series of almost invisible micro-awakenings? What if the problem isn't a lack of meaning, but an excessive distraction that prevents us from noticing when it appears? Have you ever noticed how most days pass without leaving a trace? As if you lived, but weren't truly present. How many moments today do you remember with real clarity, without needing to resort to photos or messages? This question haunted me for weeks. I carried it with me to work, to the bank queue, into my house. I realized that whenever I was silent for more than a few seconds, an immediate discomfort arose, almost a mental itch that demanded stimulation. Opening an app, turning on the television, anything to avoid being alone with myself. Old texts describe this as the fear of facing emptiness, but perhaps it's more accurate to say that we are afraid of facing our own presence. In one of the codices, there's an almost erased phrase that says recognition begins when the noise ceases, not outside, but inside. This seemed absurd to me at first, because the world is noisy by nature. Then I understood that the noise they were referring to isn't auditory, it's narrative. It's the constant story we tell ourselves about who we are, what we should want, what it means to succeed, to fail, to be someone. When this story is interrupted, even for seconds, something different appears. I started experiencing this in mundane moments, like brushing my teeth or walking to the bakery. Instead of thinking about my next appointment, I would try to simply notice the ground beneath my feet, the weight of my body, my breathing. Nothing extraordinary happened, but a kind of space opened up, as if I had changed rooms within my own mind. And the more I did this, the more I realized how absent I was from my own life. Do you also notice this emptiness when you stop for a few moments? Or do you prefer to fill it before even feeling the discomfort? The Gnostics spoke of the first gate as recognition, but not in the mystical sense that many imagine. It was recognizing oneself as someone who perceives. Not a social role, not a function, but the very capacity to be conscious. When I read this, I understood why so many translators stumble over these passages. There is no way to explain this state with common concepts, because it does not refer to something you possess, but to something you are when you are not occupied with being something else. A friend, who had never read anything on the subject, once told me that after a minor car accident, he spent a few minutes sitting on the sidewalk, staring into nothingness, feeling a strange clarity, as if everything was in its right place for the first time. It didn't last long, but it marked him forever. He couldn't find words for it, but described it as a memory without an object, a certainty without content. When I read similar accounts in manuscripts, I understood that this type of experience has always existed, it just never been legitimized. Isn't it curious how these experiences arise in the intervals, in the collapses of routine, in the moments when something breaks the usual flow? What does this say about the way we conduct our days? The texts also suggest that forgetting is not a flaw, but a mechanism. A kind of protection that prevents overload. The problem is when we forget too much and begin to confuse the mechanism with reality. Then everything becomes a task, a goal, a performance, and life begins to be measured by results, not by presence. Perhaps that's why so many people feel a tiredness that doesn't go away with rest, because it's not physical fatigue, but a detachment from oneself. On a particularly quiet night, I reread a passage in which the author compares consciousness to an echo that has forgotten its own voice. I thought the image was exaggerated until I realized how much we spend our lives repeating ideas we didn't choose, values we inherited, fears we learned. The echo doesn't know where it came from, it just keeps sounding. What if recognition, in practice, is that moment when you realize you're repeating something that doesn't belong to you? What if, upon noticing this, you're already opening a crack in the automatic narrative? I don't offer definitive answers because manuscripts don't either. They provoke, insinuate, leave gaps. Perhaps that's why they were so feared. A doctrine can be fought, but a question infiltrates, takes root, grows on its own. The true heresy may not lie in the content, but in the attitude of questioning everything, including questioning itself. As you read, notice what happens when you finish one paragraph and move on to the next. Is there a pause? A microsecond of suspension? That's where something can happen, not like an epiphany, but like a shift. A step off the rails. Can you remember the last time you felt fully present, without doing anything special? And why is that kind of memory so rare? In the next part, I will explore how some texts describe simple, almost invisible practices that promise nothing, but create conditions for this recognition to cease being an exception and begin to infiltrate daily life. Not as a ritual, but as a silent attitude towards what you already experience. When I started cross-referencing accounts of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts with stories from ordinary people, something improbable began to emerge. It wasn't about miracles or spectacular experiences, but about small changes in how life was perceived after someone came into contact with this type of reading. A librarian from Minas Gerais told me that, after months of reading Gnostic texts out of curiosity, he began to notice strange patterns in his own routine, as if mundane events were beginning to align. He didn't win the lottery, he didn't get rich, he simply realized that decisions that previously paralyzed him now emerged with clarity. He didn't use mystical terms, he just said it was as if he had stopped fighting with himself. This type of account was repeated with subtle variations. A woman from the interior of Sarah wrote saying that, after reading passages about the spark, she began to pay attention to dreams she had previously ignored. Not prophetic dreams, but images that made her wake up with a sense of order, as if something inside her had been arranged during the night. An engineering student told me that, while studying old translations out of sheer academic boredom, he began to realize how many choices in his life were made out of inertia, not out of will. None of them spoke of salvation or enlightenment. They spoke of lucidity. Historical data also brings surprises. Few people know, for example, that the Nag Hammadi codices were forgotten in libraries for years because no one knew what to do with them. Many scholars considered them too exotic for the curriculum. Some fragments were even reused as binding for ordinary books, as if they were just pieces of old leather. Thinking about this today is almost comical, as if someone had used pages from an old map to wrap bread. This initial disregard may be proof that the danger of these texts was never in their explicit content, but in what they awaken when someone allows themselves to read them attentively. There were also almost unbelievable episodes, such as that of a German professor who, upon publishing an alternative translation of a Gnostic passage in the 1970s, suddenly lost funding for his research. No official censorship, just bureaucratic silence, inexplicable cuts, invitations that ceased to arrive. He himself never accused anyone, but wrote in personal letters that he felt as if he had touched on something he shouldn't have. Decades later, his personal archives revealed that he himself doubted his own conclusions, not because he thought them false, but because he feared the implications. The most curious thing is that, even with all the technology available, these texts continue to circulate in niches, almost as if they chose their readers. You can easily find them in PDF format, but rarely does anyone read them to the end. Perhaps because they promise nothing. They don't offer ready-made solutions. They don't sell formulas for happiness. They simply expose the uncomfortable idea that most of what we do is reaction, not choice. This realization begins to change the way a person views their own day. The repetitive commute to work ceases to be just a journey and becomes a sequence of ignored micro-decisions. The moment of picking up the cell phone ceases to be automatic and becomes an observed gesture. None of this is heroic, but it is profoundly destabilizing because it reveals how much of our lives is conducted without our being present. There's a rarely quoted passage in one of the codices that says something like forgetfulness is the wall, not the enemy. When I read that, I immediately thought about how many times, throughout life, something important has been set aside not out of malice, but out of tiredness, haste, or distraction. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what was hidden, but what was abandoned due to lack of attention. Some more daring researchers have even raised curious hypotheses about the survival of these texts. Some say that they resurface cyclically during periods of cultural crisis, as if functioning as a kind of collective reminder. There is no proof of this, of course, but the coincidence is intriguing. They appear in a world tired of easy answers, saturated with information, but hungry for meaning. Perhaps that's why you're here now, reading something that doesn't fit neatly into any category. It's not religion, it's not self-help, it's not science. It's a narrative that spans centuries and yet blends with a cold coffee on your table, with the distant noise of the street, with the feeling that the day is passing too quickly. This mixture of ancient and everyday is what makes everything so strange and, at the same time, so familiar. What I learned from following these improbable accounts and data is that the impact of these texts lies not in creating new beliefs, but in dismantling certainties. They don't add layers, they remove them. As if each careful reading removed an invisible film that has accumulated over perception over the years. And that's precisely why the story doesn't end here. Because, after something is taken away, a space remains, and space never stays empty for long. In the next part, I'll explore how that void begins to be filled, not by something external, but by an almost silent internal reorganization, which many only realize when they can no longer return to being exactly as they were before. When the inner space begins to open up, even if the person can't explain why, something changes in the rhythm of life. It's not a visible change to those on the outside. You continue waking up early, dealing with cues, messages, deadlines. But inside there's a new tension, as if two layers of reality were overlapping. One continues to make everything work, the other observes, silently, almost suspicious of every automatic movement. It was at this point that many people I spoke to reported a kind of rupture. Not an emotional collapse, but a specific moment when they realized they could no longer pretend nothing was happening. One man told me that, in the middle of a mundane meeting at work, he felt an almost uncontrollable urge to get up and leave, not out of anger, but out of a sudden clarity that he was repeating a scene he had already lived dozens of times without ever truly being present. He didn't leave, but the realization remained like a crack that won't close. Another person described something similar while listening to an old song on the radio. Nothing special in the lyrics, nothing that directly related to the themes we are discussing here, but suddenly, a vague childhood memory surfaced, not as an image, but as a feeling of being at home in a place she couldn't name. It lasted for seconds, but it was enough to change her entire day. She began walking the streets as if she were waiting for something, without knowing exactly what. These episodes don't appear in history books or academic research, but they repeat themselves with surprising frequency. It's as if, after a certain point, the person starts stumbling over themselves, perceiving their own habits as if they belong to someone else. The tension comes from there, from the conflict between what has always been normal and what no longer seems so obvious. In some ancient texts, there's the idea that this moment is more difficult than any revelation because it doesn't offer an immediate answer. It simply dismantles. It doesn't say what to do. It only shows that continuing to do everything the same way is no longer satisfactory. That's why many people retreat at this stage. Not out of fear of something supernatural, but out of weariness of sustaining a doubt that doesn't fit into any agenda. I went through this myself when I realized I could no longer read certain news stories without feeling like I was participating in a theatrical performance. Nothing had changed in the structure of the world, but the way I perceived it seemed shifted a few centimeters to the side, enough to make everything strangely artificial. It wasn't rebellion, it was lucidity, and lucidity can be uncomfortable. The turning point comes when this strangeness ceases to be merely uncomfortable and begins to generate practical questions. Not grand questions, but simple ones. Why do I react this way? Why do I avoid that silence? Why do I need to fill every interval with something? These questions don't appear as an organized list, they infiltrate gestures, thoughts that arise in the middle of the night, involuntary pauses during the day. There's also the other side of this phase, less discussed, a feeling of closeness to people you don't even know. Several readers reported that, after reflecting on these issues for a while, they began to recognize the same kind of discomfort in others, even when no one said anything. A glance on public transport, an out-of-context comment, a nervous laugh in a casual conversation. Small signs that the experience is not isolated. All of this creates an atmosphere of expectation that is difficult to describe. There is no expectation of a specific event, but rather a reorganization. As if something were being prepared in the background, beyond the direct reach of one's will. The texts say little about this period, perhaps because it doesn't fit into heroic narratives. There is no victory, no final revelation, only the realization that there is no turning back. And that's where the story approaches a critical point. Because when you can no longer ignore these changes, a silent choice arises. To continue living as before, trying to push these questions to the back of your mind, or to allow them to gradually reorganize how you perceive yourself. It's not about abandoning anything immediately, but about accepting that something has begun and will not be stopped by willpower. Many try to speed up this process, seeking ready-made answers, techniques, formulas. They almost always end up frustrated, because what's at stake is not adding something to life, but removing excesses, layers of noise, inherited expectations. It's a simplification process that paradoxically requires courage. At this point, the internal rhythm intensifies. You begin to notice when a decision doesn't originate from you, when a reaction is merely a reflex. This recognition doesn't bring immediate relief, but creates constant pressure to align thought and action. It's not uncommon for relationships to change, interests to transform, and old habits to lose their meaning without drama, simply because they no longer fit. And so, almost without realizing it, you arrive at the edge of something that hasn't yet been named, but which presents itself as a concrete possibility. Not a promise of magical transformation, but the chance to traverse this discomfort and discover what remains when so many layers begin to fall away. It is this point of suspension, of contained expectation, that leads us directly to the denouement, where the narrative ceases to be mere observation and inevitably becomes a stance. Perhaps you've arrived here without realizing how much has changed since the first line. There were no fireworks, no promise of miracles, just a sequence of almost invisible shifts, like when the tide recedes and, suddenly, what was submerged becomes part of a landscape. This is the kind of ending that doesn't close doors, but opens windows. Not outwards, but inwards, to a territory you've always carried with you and almost never visited attentively. If there's one thing that ancient manuscripts, improbable accounts, and everyday experiences have in common, it's the idea that recognition begins with the simplest gesture: stopping. Stopping for a few seconds before responding, before reacting, before filling the silence. Not as a sophisticated technique, but as a conscious choice. Tomorrow, when you wake up, try sitting on the edge of your bed for a full minute without picking up your phone, just feeling the weight of your body and your breath. Don't look for anything, just notice. That minute, repeated every day, is more transformative than any grand promise. Throughout the day, notice the moments when you go on autopilot. The bank queue, the traffic, the screen you scroll through without realizing how much time is passing. Instead of blaming yourself, just notice. Mentally say, "I am here now." This phrase is not a mantra, it's an anchor. It brings you back to the point where life is really happening, not in memory, not in expectation, but in the present moment. When night falls and tiredness sets in, don't just treat it as something to be eliminated. Ask yourself, with quiet honesty, where it comes from. It's not always a lack of rest, often it's an excess of detachment. It's your body telling you that you spent the whole day elsewhere. Write a sentence about what most caught your attention during the day, even if it's banal. A smell, a conversation, an image. This short, Almost unassuming writing creates a thread of continuity between who you were during the day and who you are when no one is watching. Perhaps you'll realize that, over time, certain questions begin to arise on their own. Not mystical questions, but practical ones. Why do I do this? Why do I avoid that? Why do I repeat this pattern? Don't answer them all at once. Some don't want a solution, they just want to be heard. This space of listening is what ancient texts describe as recognition, but you don't need that name. Just call it presence. If, at any point, you feel like abandoning all of this because it seems too simple, remember that the greatest changes are rarely noisy. They settle in as discrete habits, like a new way of walking down the same street, like a gaze that begins to notice what has always been there. Personal transformation doesn't happen when you become another person, but when you begin to fully inhabit who you already are. I can't promise specific results because each journey is unique. What I can say, based on everything I've observed and experienced, is that the practice of mindfulness changes the quality of choices. You begin to notice when something doesn't make sense before it turns into a crisis. You begin to identify opportunities not as luck, but as a consequence of being present. Above all, you begin to treat your own life as something you live, not something you manage. If this video touched you in any way, don't let the experience end here. Write in the comments what caught your attention the most, even if it's just one word. If you prefer, do it anonymously, but do it. Sharing is a way to consolidate what was experienced. Like this video so that other people who are also searching for meaning amidst the noise can find it. And subscribe to the channel to continue this journey with me, step by step, without haste, without empty promises, only with the willingness to be present and allow life itself to gradually reveal itself.